She was 8 years old, paralyzed for 2 years, and surrounded by every specialist money could buy. None of them could make her walk. But the moment she saw a broken, dismissed stranger standing alone in the corner of a glittering ballroom, the man every guest had turned their back on, the man security had just humiliated in front of hundreds, something happened that no doctor, no therapist, and no amount of money had ever been able to produce. Rosalie Prescott pushed herself out of her wheelchair, and she walked toward him. If this is your first time here, welcome, and if you've been with us a while, you already know this channel is where stories live that stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss what's coming next, because the stories we're bringing you don't end where you expect them to. Drop a like on this video and leave a comment telling us what city and country you're watching from. It genuinely means everything to see how far these stories travel. Now, settle in. This one is going to take something out of you. The Hargrove Grand Hotel had been built to make people feel small. That was the point, of course not that anyone would say so directly. The 40-foot ceilings, the marble columns hauled in from somewhere in Europe, the chandeliers that looked like someone had frozen an explosion in crystal, all of it was designed to communicate a single message: you are standing inside power. For the guests arriving that Saturday evening in tailored suits and gowns that cost more than most people's monthly rent, the message landed as intended. They walked in straighter. They spoke a little louder. They smiled the particular smile of people who believe the room belongs to them. Brennan Thorne walked through the service entrance at 4:47 in the afternoon and went straight to the supply closet on the 3rd floor. He had a work order for 2 things: replace a cracked ceiling tile in the east corridor and check the HVAC vent near the ballroom's north wall before the evening event. 45 minutes of work, maybe an hour if the vent filter was as bad as the maintenance log suggested. Then he'd collect his hourly rate, drive 40 minutes home, and be there in time to help Kendra finish her science project before she fell asleep at the kitchen table the way she sometimes did when she'd pushed herself too hard. Brennan was good at estimating time. He had spent years of his life in environments where time estimation was the difference between everyone going home and nobody going home. He didn't think about those years much anymore. He tried not to. The ballroom setup was already in progress when he arrived at the north wall. Caterers were arranging tables. A florist was arguing quietly with an event coordinator about centerpiece heights. 2 men in earpieces stood near the main imps, sweeping the room with the kind of practiced disinterest that meant they were paying attention to everything. Brennan glanced at them once, noted their positions, and went back to the vent panel. He was on his knees with a screwdriver when he heard the wheels. Not a cart, lighter than that. The specific, slightly irregular rhythm of a wheelchair being pushed across marble by someone who hadn't quite gotten the technique, right? Someone leaning a little too far forward, compensating for it. He didn't look up. Not his business. Then the wheels stopped somewhere close, and he heard a child's voice. Is that hard? He looked up then. The girl was maybe 8 years old. She had dark hair pulled back unevenly one side tighter than the other, like she'd done it herself and hadn't quite finished, and she was watching him with the kind of direct, uncomplicated curiosity that children manage before the world teaches them that staring is rude. Her legs were resting against the footrests of the wheelchair. Not moving, fixing a vent, Brennan said. Yeah. Not really, he turned a screw. You just have to know which direction. The girl considered that. Which direction is it? Righty-tighty, lefty-loosey. She repeated it quietly like she was filing it away.
I'm Rosalie.
Brennan, why are you on the floor? Because that's where the vent is. She looked at the vent, then back at him. My mom says people who work hard don't make excuses. Your mom's right, she also says I work hard. A pause. In therapy, for my legs. Brennan looked at her then. Really looked. The way she held herself in the chair, there was tension in her shoulders that wasn't just bad posture. She was braced, like she'd learned to hold her body carefully, the way you hold something fragile that you're afraid to drop. I bet you do, he said. Rosalie looked at him for another moment. Then a woman appeared at the edge of his peripheral vision, moving fast. Rosalie, sweetheart, I told you not to wander. The woman was somewhere around 30 sharp eyes, a dark green evening dress that probably cost more than Brennan made in 2 months. and the particular exhausted tension of someone running on too little sleep and too much control. She put both hands on the wheelchair handles and looked at Brennan the way people in this building often looked at him, taking in the work clothes, the worn knees of his jeans, the toolbox. "Sorry if she bothered you," she said. Her tone wasn't unkind, exactly. Just brisk. "She didn't," Brennan said. The woman nodded once and turned the chair. Rosalie looked back at him over her shoulder. He went back to the vent. He'd been in this hotel for 6 weeks on a rotating temporary contract, and in that time he'd noticed Rosalie Prescott 3 times before tonight. The first time was in the hotel's lower-level therapy room, which was rented out to a rehabilitation practice twice a week. He'd been replacing a baseboard near the door when the session was happening inside, and he'd heard not the physical therapy itself, but what came between the exercises. The small sounds of a child pushing against something that scared her. The particular silence after a failure. He recognized those sounds from a different context, a different life, but the shape of them was the same. The second time, he'd been eating lunch in the service corridor when Rosalie's chair had come around the corner ahead of her mother. The girl had seen him and given a small wave. He'd waved back. The third time, he'd been near the elevator bank when her wheelchair had gotten its left wheel briefly stuck in a floor mat. Her mother wasn't there. A hotel guest had walked past without looking down. Brennan had crouched, freed the wheel, and then stepped back before Rosalie could thank him. He hadn't wanted a thing from her. He just fixed what needed fixing. He thought about those 3 moments while he drove home that night, which was unusual. He wasn't typically given to thinking about strangers. But something about the way that kid held herself, that braced, careful, slightly terrified tension, had somewhere behind his sternum all week, like a splinter he couldn't quite reach. He knew that posture. He'd worn it himself once in a different kind of aftermath. The charity event was called the Prescott Foundation Annual Gala, and Brennan would have known nothing about it, except that the maintenance supervisor had left a note on the board. All staff, North Ballroom, restricted access 6 p.m. onward. Complete work orders before or stay clear. He finished the vent at 5:38 and was packing up his toolbox when the evening's first guests began filtering in. He should have left. He was standing near a side corridor, toolbox in hand, when the thing with the display happened. It was one of those elaborate event installations, a glass and metal tower of some kind, part art piece, part corporate branding, set up near the south wall. Brennan had noticed it earlier because it was positioned badly, too close to one of the main foot traffic paths, base not weighted properly for a marble floor, and whoever had installed it had used a mounting bracket that wasn't rated for the height. He'd thought about mentioning it. He hadn't. Not his job, not his event. At 6:12, a waiter carrying a tray of champagne glasses cut too close to the south corridor, clipped the base with his foot, and the tower came down with a sound that briefly stopped every conversation in the ballroom. Glass, metal, scattered across 10 square feet of marble floor. Nobody was hurt. But Brennan was the closest person to it he'd been walking past, and when everyone turned towards the sound, he was standing 2 feet from the wreckage with his toolbox in his hand. The security director materialized within seconds. Brennan didn't know his name yet. He was a large man with a carefully maintained face and the kind of practiced authority that came from spending years deciding who belonged and who didn't. "You," the security director pointed at Brennan. "Don't move." "I was walking past," Brennan said. "I said don't move." A woman in a catering uniform was already talking to another security guard across the room, pointing at the waiter who'd actually caused it. Brennan could see that. The security director could probably see it too. He wasn't looking at the catering staff. Guests had pulled back from the area, and in that particular way of crowds not hostile, just reshuffling the empty space around Brennan had gotten larger. He was aware of it. The looks, the positioning, the quiet assessment that happened when someone with a toolbox stood next to broken glass at a black tie event and didn't look like he was supposed to be there. He'd felt this before. Different circumstances, different uniforms, same assessment. Some things traveled. The security directors spent 4 minutes grilling him. Another employee confirmed what had actually happened. The security director dismissed Brennan with the specific coldness of someone who is annoyed at being wrong, but has no intention of saying so. Brennan picked up his toolbox and walked toward the far corner of the ballroom, toward a quieter exit. The murmuring followed him, not loud, just present. The way static is present underneath everything, not quite a sound. He found an empty section of wall near the north end and stopped, because the service door he needed was through the ballroom and he'd have to wait for a gap in the crowd anyway. He stood with his toolbox. He looked at nothing in particular. He did not perform discomfort because he didn't feel it, exactly more like a low tiredness. The particular tiredness that came from spending years learning to care less about the opinion of rooms. He thought about Kendra. He thought about whether she'd remembered to feed the cat tonight, or if he'd come home to find the thing sitting on the kitchen counter staring at him with the expression of an animal who had been catastrophically wronged. He thought briefly about the girl in the wheelchair. And then the murmuring in the room changed. It wasn't louder. It was different, sharper. The sound of surprise moving through a crowd, not alarm, but something adjacent. Brennan looked up. Across the ballroom, near a table by the center aisle, a wheelchair sat empty, and a small figure was standing beside it. He recognized her before he could have explained how. The dark hair, one side still uneven. The green dress that was probably new and slightly too long. The careful, terrified, absolutely determined posture of someone who has been told by her body for 2 years that this particular thing is not possible, and who has decided right now, without warning, in the middle of a ballroom full of people she doesn't know, to call that a lie. Rosalie Prescott was standing up. Her legs were shaking badly. Her hands had gone to her sides and her fingers were spread open, like she was trying to grip air for balance. Her face was pale and focused in the specific way of someone who is spending everything they have on a single moment. The crowd had pulled back. A woman her mother was 15 feet away and moving, the particular panicked stride of a parent watching something happen that they don't yet understand and are afraid to interrupt. Brennan watched Rosalie take her first step. It was not graceful. Her right foot came forward and landed wrong heel first, weight distributed badly, her whole left side dipping to compensate. She caught herself, barely. Her breath came out in an audible rush. Then she took another step. She was moving across the ballroom. She was moving toward him. He didn't move. He understood, instinctively, that moving toward her was wrong, that she was doing something, and the something required her to keep doing it, not to be met halfway. He understood that from a place in himself that he didn't examine often. So he stayed. When she was about 10 feet away, he set down his toolbox slowly and he crouched. Not all the way to the floor, just low enough that they were closer to the same level, and so his voice, when he used it, wouldn't have to travel as far. "Heel," he said, quietly enough that it probably didn't carry past the 3 feet between them. "Roll to the ball of your foot. Don't land flat." Her next step was fractionally better. Weight even, both sides. She was 8 feet away. 6. She was breathing hard. The shaking in her legs was visible from here, not trembling, exactly, but the specific vibration of muscle working past its comfortable limit, past anything it had been asked to do in a long time. "Don't look at the floor," Brennan said. "Look at something level." "Right here." He held up 2 fingers at eye level. She looked at his fingers. 5 feet. 4. Then her left knee buckled. He was already moving, not fast, not dramatic, just forward, and he caught her before she hit the marble, one arm coming under her, the other steadying her back. She didn't fall. She came down against him in a controlled way that felt, improbably, like the ending she'd intended. The ballroom was completely silent. Rosalie was breathing hard against his shoulder. Her whole body was shaking with the exertion and the release of it. He could feel her hands gripping his work shirt. Then she lifted her face and looked up at him. "I did it," she said. Her voice was halfway between question and statement. "Yeah," Brennan said. "You did." Behind them, the ballroom erupted. And through the crowd, moving fast and unsteady in her green evening dress, came a woman with exhausted eyes and wet cheeks, who was not moving like a billionaire anymore. She was moving like a mother. "Rosalie." The word came out cracked, not elegant. Adeline Prescott dropped to her knees on the marble floor, without a thought for her dress, her hands going to her daughter's face, her shoulders. Checking, making sure. The way you have to touch someone to believe they're real. Rosalie grabbed her mother's wrist. Mom, I walked." I saw Adeline's voice was completely gone. "I saw, baby." 12 steps, I counted. Adeline let out a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. She pulled Rosalie in against her and held on. Brennan stood, stepped back. The moment didn't belong to him, and he knew it. He retrieved his toolbox from the floor. He thought about the service door. He thought about Kendra and the cat and the science project on the kitchen table. Then he heard Adeline's voice, and it had changed again. Sharper now, the billionaire had returned. Wait, she was looking up at him over Rosalie's head. What did you do to her? Brennan looked at her. Nothing. You said something to her. I watched you. Told her how to place her feet. That's all. She's been in physical therapy for 18 months. She hasn't. Adeline stopped. Started again. She hasn't done anything like this. Not once. And she gestured at him, his toolbox, his general everything. Who are you? I work here, Brennan said. Maintenance. The skepticism on her face was thorough and unflattering, and he understood it. He wasn't offended by it. I want to know exactly who you are, Adeline said. Rosalie spoke first. She had pulled back slightly from her mother and was looking up at Brennan with the same direct, uncomplicated attention from earlier in the evening, that curious, unhurried gaze that had nothing to prove and nothing to hide. I know who he is, she said. Both adults looked at her. I saw it, Rosalie said. In his wallet, when it fell out that other time by the elevator. She looked at Brennan. The picture of you. You were in a uniform. There were other people, but you could see your face. Brennan was very still. And there was a thing on your jacket, Rosalie continued. A bird. With its wings spread, she demonstrated vaguely with her hands. With an anchor. The ballroom around them was still loud, with the aftermath of the moment, people talking, staff moving, someone calling for a doctor who wasn't needed. But right here in this small 3-foot radius, it was quiet. Adeline looked at Brennan. Brennan looked at Rosalie. He said nothing. Then, without a word, he picked up his toolbox, turned, and walked toward the service exit. And Adeline Prescott watched him go with the particular expression of a woman who has just realized she is looking at the edge of something much larger than what she can currently see, something she is absolutely certain. With the bone-deep certainty of a person who has survived in rooms full of people who hide things, she needs to understand completely. The service exit door swung shut behind Brennan with a sound that was quiet and final, and Adeline was still on her knees on the marble floor when it happened. She didn't move immediately. One hand was still resting on Rosalie's back, and her daughter was warm and real against her palm, and the physical fact of that, the impossible, unearned, completely unexplained fact of it was still moving through her in waves she didn't have a category for. Around them, the ballroom had recomposed itself the way crowds always do after something unexpected, quickly, imperfectly, with a lot of noise covering the discomfort of having witnessed something private in a public place. Staff were already moving toward the scattered debris of the earlier display case. Guests had drifted back toward their tables, most of them pretending they hadn't been staring. A woman near the champagne station was telling the story to her companion with the particular velocity of someone who wants to be the first one to explain a thing they don't fully understand. Adeline heard none of it. She was looking at the service door. Mom, Rosalie tugged her sleeve. Mom, you're doing the face. What face? The face where you're thinking so hard you forget I'm here. Adeline pulled back and looked at her daughter. Rosalie's legs were resting again. She'd been lifted carefully back into the chair by one of the hotel staff, before Adeline had quite processed it happening, and the exhaustion was visible now in the way it always was. After Rosalie pushed hard, a slight grayness around her eyes, the careful way she held her shoulders. But her expression was different from any post-therapy exhaustion Adeline had seen before. She looked satisfied, the specific bone-deep satisfaction of someone who has settled a long-running argument with themselves. Are you hurting? Adeline asked. A little. My legs feel like they're full of sand. We should get you to the room. You need to rest. I know. Rosalie didn't argue, which meant she actually was tired. She let her mother begin moving the chair without protest. Then, after a moment, he's been watching me for a while, you know. Adeline stopped pushing. Not in a bad way, Rosalie added quickly, reading something in the quality of the silence. I mean, he noticed me in the therapy room. He walked by once and looked in through the window, and I waved at him and he waved back. She paused. He fixed my wheel once, by the elevator. That's when I saw the wallet. You didn't tell me about this. I didn't think it was a thing to tell. He was just nice. Rosalie looked up at her over her shoulder. He talked to me like I was a regular person. Not like I was sick. Adeline started moving the chair again. She said nothing for several seconds. That thing you said, she finally said. The bird with its wings spread. The anchor. On his jacket in the picture. Did it look like this? Adeline sketched a shape in the air above the chair, rough but deliberate. Rosalie looked at her hands. Maybe. Why? What is it? I'm not sure, Adeline said, but she was. Marcus Webb had worked for Adeline Prescott for 7 years, and in that time he had developed a nearly perfect read on her moods. There was the controlled urgent mode, which meant something significant had gone wrong in business. There was the cold precise mode, which meant someone had made the mistake of lying to her face. There was the exhausted but fine mode, which she deployed when Rosalie had had a hard therapy day and Adeline's was holding it together through will alone. He had never seen this particular mode before. She found him in the hotel corridor outside the event's coordination room at 7:40 p.m., and she was walking with the specific economy of motion that meant the conversation was going to be efficient. The maintenance worker, she said. The one involved in the display case incident. Brennan something. I need everything. Marcus had heard about the incident. He'd also heard about what happened after it, because the entire event staff had heard about it. He kept his expression professional. Define everything. Employment records from this hotel. His own records, wherever they exist. Work history. Background. She paused. Military history. Marcus looked at her for a moment. That last one can be complicated depending on... I know it can be complicated, Adeline said. That's why I'm asking you and not a database. Timeline? I want a preliminary picture by tomorrow morning. She turned to head back toward the elevator. And Marcus quietly. I'm not going after him. I just need to understand what I'm looking at. And if there's nothing to find, she didn't break stride. Then there's nothing to find. But I don't think that's what's going to happen. She was right. Marcus called her at 7:15 the following morning, and his voice had the particular careful flatness of someone delivering information they're still in the process of processing themselves. The hotel has him as a contract maintenance employee, hired 6 weeks ago through a temp agency. Before that, similar contract work at 2 other facilities. Consistent, clean record, no complaints, no incidents. He paused. Before that, 7 years of military service, Navy. Standard deployment record for the first 4 years. Then what? Then the records get thin. Very thin. The kind of thin that doesn't happen by accident. Another pause. There are official service dates. There's an honorable discharge. But the assignments for roughly 3 years in the middle, the operational detail isn't there. Or it's there, and it's been classified in a way that my contacts won't touch without a federal-level clearance request. Adeline was quiet for a moment. She was standing at the window of her hotel suite, with her coffee going cold in her hand, looking at the city below in the early morning gray. He has a daughter, Marcus continued, 9 years old. Kendra. Her mother died approximately 4 years ago accident, verified, and he's been sole custodial parent since then. That part of the record is complete and clean. Where does he live? Rental 40 minutes out, modest, pays his rent on time, a brief pause. Adeline. What is this about? She told him what Rosalie had said. The uniform, the wallet photograph, the insignia on the jacket. There was silence on Marcus's end for long enough that she said, Are you still there? I'm here, he said. I'm just thinking about the fact that you let him walk out of a ballroom last night after your daughter told you that. I didn't let him do anything. He left. You could have stopped him. With what? He hadn't done anything wrong. She turned from the window. He still hasn't. All I know is that he's a former serviceman who may have had a classified assignment history and who has apparently been paying quiet attention to my daughter during her therapy sessions. That's not a threat. That's a detail I need to understand. And if the understanding leads somewhere complicated, then we deal with complicated. She set down the coffee. Keep looking. And find out his schedule at the hotel when he's next contracted to come in. Brennan's next shift was Tuesday. He knew nothing about the conversation that had taken place over his head, which was fine by him. He showed up at 8 a.m., signed in with the maintenance supervisor, collected his work order for the day, and spent the first 2 hours replacing a damaged door hinge on the 4th floor and fixing a leak under a sink in the 3rd floor employee lounge. Ordinary work. He was good at ordinary work. He'd gotten good at it deliberately, the same way he'd gotten good at other things before it, by paying attention, doing it right the first time, and not making it mean more than it was. He was eating lunch in the service corridor sandwich from home. The same turkey and mustard he made every morning, because Kendra claimed to hate mustard, but kept eating the halves he gave her when he heard footsteps that weren't the maintenance staff's. He looked up. Adeline Prescott was standing at the entrance to the corridor in a charcoal blazer and dark slacks, looking like she'd materialized from a boardroom. Behind her, at a respectful distance that suggested he'd been told specifically to give space, stood a man with a tablet and the bearing of someone used to waiting. She looked at Brennan for a moment, then at the sandwich. "You eat in here," she said. "Queter," he said. She looked at the concrete walls, the industrial shelving, the Sinz-Engel overhead light that buzzed faintly. "Can I?" She gestured at the empty space of corridor. "It's the hotel's corridor. I'm asking if you mind." "No," he said. She came forward and stood a few feet away, and it was clear she hadn't thought past this point. She'd expected resistance, maybe, or deflection, and the simple accommodation of it had thrown off whatever she'd prepared. She recalibrated quickly. He could see her do it. "My daughter walked 12 steps on Saturday," she said. "I know, I was there. She hasn't moved her legs independently in over 2 years. Not like that. Not voluntarily." She paused. "Her therapy team is calling it a breakthrough. They're using words like spontaneous motor recovery and psychological release." Another pause. "What I want to know is what you actually did." "I told you what I did." "You told me you said something about foot placement." Her eyes were direct and not unkind, but they were thorough. The eyes of someone who read contracts for hidden language. That's not enough. Brennan set down his sandwich. He thought about how to say it. He wasn't good at explaining this particular category of the thing. The mechanics of it were clear to him. But translating them into something that worked for someone who'd never understood fear from the inside took effort. "She wasn't stuck because of her legs," he finally said. "The legs are part of it, but that's not the whole thing. She was scared. She's been through extensive therapy." "I know, and the therapy addresses the physical component. But fear has its own component, and it's not always the same thing. She was afraid that if she tried and failed, that was the final answer." He looked at Adeline steadily. "I recognize that. I've seen it before. Different context, but the shape of it's the same." Something shifted slightly in Adeline's face. "Where have you seen it before?" "That's a longer conversation." "I have time." "I don't," he said. It wasn't rude, just true. "I've got a work order for the east stairwell at 1. Adeline studied him for a moment. He let her. He'd been studied by people with more resources and better reasons, and he had a basic tolerance for it. "My daughter says you've been kind to her," she said. 3 separate times she can name. "She likes you." "She's a good kid." "She is." A pause. "She also told me about the photograph." Brennan picked up his sandwich. "I'm not here to dig into your service record," Adeline said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm here because my daughter walked 12 steps toward a man she specifically sought out, and I'm responsible for understanding why, and I can't do that if I don't understand who you are." "You had someone look into me," Brennan said. "Not a question." "Yes. And your military history has gaps that aren't typical." He took a bite of his sandwich and chewed. She waited. "I served," he said finally. "I did my time. I'm out." "That's the version I give people, and it's accurate." "What's the version you don't give people?" He looked at her. "That version doesn't exist in this conversation." The silence stretched. A pipe somewhere in the building ticked. "My daughter's therapist," Adeline said, switching directions with the precision of someone who knows when a door is closed, thinks the breakthrough is fragile. That the psychological component, the fear barrier, is still there, and that without consistent reinforcement, she may regress. She paused. She suggested that whatever happened Saturday, the dynamic that helped Rosalie move. "No," Brennan said. Adeline stopped. "Whatever you're about to ask." "No," he said. He wasn't unkind about it either. Just clear. "I'm a maintenance contractor. I'm not a therapist. I'm not equipped to be part of your daughter's rehabilitation, and I'm not interested in being part of your daughter's story. I was in a room when something happened. That's all that was." "You crouched down," Adeline said. "You talked her through 4 steps in real time. You caught her before she hit the floor. That wasn't incidental. It was instinct. What kind of instinct does that?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "The kind that's not relevant to your daughter's recovery program." Adeline's jaw tightened fractionally. She was not a woman who lost arguments often, and she was smart enough to know that pushing harder right now wasn't going to move this. She took a breath. "I'm asking you to think about it," she said. "Not to commit. Not to disclose anything about yourself you're not willing to disclose. Just think about it." He said nothing. She took that as something other than a refusal, which was probably optimistic but wasn't entirely wrong. She nodded once and turned to go. She counted them herself, Brennan said. Adeline stopped. The 12 steps. She counted every one of them. He wasn't looking at Adeline. He was looking at the wall. Most people, when they're doing something that hard, they don't have room to count. They're just surviving the attempt. He paused. She wasn't just surviving it. She was paying attention to it. That's not something I did. That's her. Adeline stood very still for a moment. Then she said quietly, "I know," and she left. He thought about the conversation that afternoon. He thought about it again while driving home, which annoyed him. He had a solid habit of leaving work behind when he got in the truck. And the fact that he couldn't locate the off switch for this particular thing was irritating in a way he didn't entirely know what to do with. The truth, which he acknowledged privately and had no intention of doing anything with, was that the conversation had landed differently than he'd expected because Adeline Prescott was different than he'd expected. He'd prepared for the version of her he'd constructed from the available evidence, wealthy, powerful, accustomed to acquiring what she needed, probably smooth in the way of people who've paid for good communication coaching. And she was all of those things. But underneath that, there was something he hadn't anticipated. She was just exhausted. The specific marrow-deep exhaustion of a person who has been fighting for something they love for a very long time with every resource they have, and is starting to run out of new ideas. He recognized that too. Different shape, same material. He got home at 5:20. Kendra was at the kitchen table with her backpack still on, which meant she'd been home less than 10 minutes. She looked up when he came in. "The cat knocked over the plant again," she said. "Which one?" "The one by the window. There's dirt everywhere." Brennan looked at the cat, who was sitting on the kitchen counter, with the expression of an animal who has long since pieces with its own decisions. He looked at the dirt trail across the floor. He got the dustpan from under the sink. "How was Scoosel?" he said. "Fine. We had a sub in math and she let us watch a video instead of doing the lesson, so I'm already behind." Kendra pulled at a zipper on her backpack. "How was work?" "Fine. Did anything happen?" He thought about the corridor. The conversation. The woman who had looked at him with something that was operating very close to the edge of desperate, dressed in a charcoal blazer, standing in a concrete service hallway, eating humble pie without actually saying the words. "Not really," he said. "Dad. You only say not really instead of no when something actually happened." He swept dirt into the dustpan. He glanced at his daughter over his shoulder. She was 9. With her mother's dark eyes and his particular talent for noticing things that were being deliberately not said. "I met someone who wants a favor," he said. "What kind of favor?" "She has a daughter who's sick. She wants me to help with." He stopped. Tried again. "She thinks I can be useful. I told her no." Kendra watched him empty the dustpan into the trash. "Is the daughter the one you told me about?" "At the hotel. The one in the wheelchair." He looked at her. "You told me about her. Like 3 weeks ago. You said there was a kid doing therapy at the hotel, and she waved at you." Kendra's expression was the kind of patient that wasn't really patience. "You remembered her name. You never remember names." Brennan was quiet for a moment. He put the dustpan back under the sink. He stood up and looked at the window over the sink, at the early dark coming in. "Yeah," he said, "same kid. And her mom is asking you for help." "Yeah, why'd you say no?" "Because it's not my place." "But you already know her, the girl."
You already?
Kendra stopped herself, and he could see her choosing words carefully, in the way she'd gotten very good at doing, in the way that sometimes worried him and sometimes made him proud beyond anything he could say. "You already care about whether she's okay, even if you didn't say yes." Brennan looked at his daughter for a long moment. "Get started on homework," he said. "Dad, homework." "Ken." She sighed, the specific theatrical sigh of a 9-year-old who has decided that adults are predictable in all the worst ways, and unzipped her backpack. Brennan took out a pan and started on dinner. He didn't think about the conversation anymore, or he tried not to. He thought about the grocery list and whether the cat had actually been fed or was just staging its perpetual hunger performance, and what Kendra's science project needed that they didn't already have in the junk drawer. He thought about 12 steps, a kid counting every single one of them because she was paying attention. He got out his phone while the pasta water heated and stared at the screen for a moment. Then he put the phone back in his pocket. Not yet. 3 days later, Adeline received the full report from Marcus, and the careful neutrality he'd maintained on the phone dissolved somewhat when he delivered it in person. He set a physical folder on her desk in her home office and sat across from her and waited while she read it. She read it twice. When she set it down, she said, he didn't go straight from regular deployment to classified's assignment. No, there was a selection process, voluntary. He tested into it. Marcus leaned forward slightly. Adeline, we're talking about a very specific tier of naval special warfare. The records that do exist, the evaluations, the training phases, the language is consistent with operators who are selected for work that doesn't appear in publicly accessible histories. The type of assignments that get attached to interagency operations. He paused. The type of operators who, when they separate, often don't talk about it because they've signed agreements that make talking about it a federal matter. He's not hiding it because he's embarrassed, Adeline said. No, he's hiding it because he's legally required to, partially and personally committed to the rest. She looked at the folder. And he walked away from all of it, voluntarily, after his wife died, yes. He put in separation papers within 60 days of her death. Marcus was quiet for a moment. By every account, which are sparse, because people in those circles don't give accounts, he was not a man anyone expected to separate. He was exceptional at what he did, and then he stopped. Adeline thought about the service corridor, the turkey sandwich, the way Brennan Thorne had sat on a concrete floor and looked at her with the calm, measuring patience of someone who has spent years operating in situations where reading people quickly is not optional. He chose his daughter over the career, she said. Yes, she was quiet for a long moment. I owe him an apology, she said. Marcus looked up. I had him investigated because I was afraid of him, she said. Or afraid of not understanding him, which amounts to the same thing where I'm concerned. She closed the folder. That was about me, not about him. You were protecting Rosalie. I was managing my own anxiety and calling it protection. She pushed the folder toward him. Set up a way for me to contact him directly. Not through the hotel that's his workplace, and I've already ambushed him there once. Something he can choose to respond to or not. A letter? She considered. Yes, actually physical. Harder to ignore than email, and it signals something different. Marcus nodded. What do you want to say? Adeline looked out the window of her home office at the gray garden below, bare-branched in the November cold. I want to say that I understand why he said no, she said, and I think he was right, and I'm not asking him to change his answer. But you want him to change his answer. I want him to meet Rosalie properly. Not in a ballroom by accident, under normal circumstances like a regular person, and let whatever happens happen. She turned back from the window. And then I want him to make his own decision. Marcus was quiet for a moment. That's a different ask than what you made in the corridor. Yes, she said, it is. The letter arrived at the rental address on a Thursday, handwritten on plain notepaper with no company header, no reference to the Prescott name anywhere in the return address. Brennan found it in the mailbox between a water bill and a catalog Kendra had somehow gotten herself onto from a craft supply company that sent things monthly without being asked. He stood at the mailbox in the cold and read it. It was 7 sentences. It said, I had someone investigate your background without your knowledge. That was my choice, and I own it. I'm not going to pretend the reasons were purely about Rosalie. Some of it was about needing to understand things I couldn't control, which is a habit I'm working on. I don't think you should do anything you've decided not to do. If you ever wanted to meet under less strange circumstances, my daughter would like that, and I think I would too. No strings, no expectation. You can throw this in the trash and I won't follow up. The last sentence was, she counted them out loud, by the way. Every step I heard her. Brennan stood at the mailbox in the cold for a moment. Then he folded the letter and put it in his jacket pocket and went inside to start dinner. He didn't throw it in the trash. And by the end of the week, Adeline Prescott had received a reply short, handwritten, with terrible penmanship that said 2 things. First, that he had a daughter too, and it seemed like the 2 girls might get along. and second, that Saturdays he was generally free. Adeline read the letter 3 times. Then she did something she almost never did in the middle of a workday. She closed her laptop, put down her phone, went and sat in Rosalie's room where her daughter was doing homework, and stayed there for a while, not talking, not checking in, not managing anything at all. Just sitting, just present. Rosalie looked up after a few minutes with the uncanny accuracy of a kid who notices everything. "Good news," she said. "Maybe," Adeline said. Rosalie looked at her for a long moment with those thoughtful, unhurried eyes. "I told you he was good," she said, and went back to her homework. The first Saturday happened at a park. Not a grand gesture of a park, not manicured gardens, or a scenic overlook with a view that cost something. It was the ordinary kind, the kind with a slightly rusty swing set and a drinking fountain that ran cold for 3 seconds, and then warm, and a gravel path around a pond where ducks had learned to be aggressive about crackers. Brennan had suggested it specifically because it was the kind of place where nobody performed anything. You either liked it or you didn't, and there was no architecture of money around it to make the liking feel like an obligation. He arrived 7 minutes early with Kendra, who had opinions about the ducks immediately. "That one's the boss," she said, pointing at a large mallard that was cutting through the rest of the group with the focus of someone who had somewhere to be. "You can always tell the boss because they don't look at anything too long." "Is that the metric you're using?" Brennan said. "It works on people too." He looked at his daughter sideways. "Where did you get that?" "School. Mia Chen says her dad says that about meetings." Kendra shrugged. "He's in finance." "Right." Adeline arrived 8 minutes after that, pushing Rosalie's chair along the gravel path with the slightly effortful lean of someone who hadn't done a lot of wheelchair navigation on uneven ground. She dressed plainly jeans, a dark jacket, hair down, and it was the first time Brennan had seen her without the particular invisible armor of the Billionaire context. She looked younger, also more tired, which probably meant the armor had been doing some functional work. Rosalie spotted Kendra before anyone had said a formal hello, and whatever careful social choreography the adults might have been planning dissolved immediately because Rosalie said, "Is that your duck?" pointing at the aggressive mallard. And Kendra said, "I just named him Gerald," and Rosalie said, "That is absolutely a Gerald," and that was more or less that. Brennan and Adeline stood a few feet apart and watched their daughters argue amiably about whether Gerald was a Gerald or more of a Dennis, and the first 5 minutes of silence between them were the most comfortable 5 minutes they'd had yet. Which wasn't saying an enormous amount, but was saying something. "She's been talking about this since Wednesday," Adeline said finally. "Kendra cleaned her room voluntarily Thursday morning," Brennan said. "I didn't ask. They've never met." "I know. Kids are strange," Adeline said.
Yeah.
Rosalie had produced crackers from somewhere her jacket pocket, apparently, which Brennan noted as good operational planning, and was conducting the feeding with the authority of someone who had been told not to feed the ducks and had made a considered decision about that. Kendra was directing, because Kendra directed things. The ducks had gathered with the focused interest of professionals arriving at work. "I owe you an explanation," Adeline said. "You owe me a letter," Brennan said. "I got that. The letter was the apology. The explanation is different." She paused. "You don't have to want it." Brennan looked at the pond for a moment. "What kind of explanation?" "The kind where I tell you why I'm the way I am, so you understand what you're dealing with if you're going to be in the vicinity of my daughter." She said it plainly, without the performance of vulnerability that he'd expected and would have found difficult to trust. Not an excuse, just context. "All right," he said. She told him about Rosalie's accident in the flat, factual way of someone who has told the story enough times to have the emotion of it stored somewhere separate from the words. A car, a parking structure, a moment of terrible, ordinary bad luck, the specific kind that happens in the gap between 1 second and the next, the kind that doesn't announce itself. Rosalie had been 5. The injuries to her legs had been extensive. The prognosis had been uncertain for a long time, then gradually less uncertain, then settled into the particular limbo of chronic rehabilitation, where progress was measured in millimeters and every millimeter felt like a negotiation. "For 2 years I have run this like a campaign," Adeline said. "The right specialists, the right equipment, the right facility. Every variable I could identify I tried to control." She paused. And then a maintenance worker in a service corridor said a few words to her from 10 feet away, and she got up and walked. That's not what happened, Brennan said. Tell me what happened. What happened is that she was ready. She'd been building toward it for a long time physically and mentally, and Saturday was the night where the math finally worked out. He looked at the pond. I didn't give her anything she didn't already have. I just didn't add anything extra that would get in her way. What does that mean? It means that sometimes when people are afraid, the most useful thing around them is someone who isn't reacting to the fear. Someone who's just present, steady. He paused. She looked across that room, and she needed to know that whatever she was walking toward wasn't going to fall apart on her. Wasn't going to panic, or grab her, or make it a bigger thing than it already was. Adeline was quiet for a moment. You're saying she picked you because you looked like you could handle it. I'm saying she picked me because I wasn't scared. And in that room full of people who were either startled or reaching for their phones to film it, that probably stood out. Something moved across Adeline's face that she didn't quite manage to contain. She turned toward the pond again. I've been so scared for so long, she said, that I've forgotten what it looks like to someone who isn't. Brennan didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything useful to say to it. Sometimes the right response to an honest thing was just to let it be honest. After a moment, Rosalie's voice rose with the excited alarm of someone witnessing injustice. Gerald just took 3 crackers in one bite. That's against the rules. There are no rules, Rosalie, Kendra said, with the patient authority of someone a full year older. There should be, Rosalie said firmly. Brennan and Adeline both exhaled at almost the same time, and what came out of Brennan might have been an almost law, the involuntary kind, and Adeline made a sound that was similar, and the particular tension of 2 people trying to navigate something complicated with no map briefly became something less heavy. They're going to be trouble together, Adeline said. Kendra's already trouble alone, Brennan said. Rosalie has opinions about systems of fairness that I find exhausting in a way I'm also very proud of. Same, different issue. Kendra's opinions are mostly about what constitutes an adequate breakfast. What does she consider adequate? Apparently whatever she's currently looking at. The bar moves. Adeline smiled. It was the first completely unguarded expression he'd seen from her, no edges to it, no calculation, just the smile of someone who is genuinely amused and hasn't had enough of that recently. It changed her face substantially. He noted that and moved past it. They met 4 more Saturdays after that first one, and then it stopped being planned. What happened instead was that Kendra asked on a Tuesday whether Rosalie's school was far from her school, and Brennan said he didn't know. And Kendra said she was asking because she wanted to know if they could take the bus together sometime, and Brennan said that was up to Rosalie's mother. And Kendra said, well, you could ask her with the particular tone of a 9-year-old who has clearly already thought this through. He texted Adeline. She texted back within 3 minutes, which for someone who received approximately 400 messages a day, on business matters alone, was not nothing. The text said, Rosalie will be aggressively enthusiastic about this. Fair warning. The bus coordination became a twice-weekly thing, which required Brennan to shift his work schedule, which he did without announcing he was doing it. Adeline found out through Rosalie Kendra's dad changed his job thing so he could pick us up and sent him a message that said simply, you didn't have to do that. He replied, I know. She didn't push further, which was the correct instinct. It was on the 4th bus pickup that Brennan first met Rosalie properly, not in a ballroom, not in a managed park setting, but in the ordinary chaos of an elementary school pickup line where Kendra came out first and immediately began explaining something with her hands, and Rosalie came behind her in the chair and was clearly already responding to whatever explanation was in progress, both of them mid-argument before they'd covered 10 feet. She's always like this, Kendra told Brennan, gesturing at Rosalie. I'm always like what? Rosalie said, already arguing before you're even done arriving. That's because you started it before I came out. Brennan crouched to Rosalie's level. Hi. Hi. She looked at him with the same direct, uncomplicated attention as always, that gaze that didn't bother with performance because she'd never learned to see the point of it. Kendra says you know how to fix basically everything. Kendra exaggerates. He says that Kendra confirmed, but last week he fixed a car with a piece of wire and a very bad attitude. It was a fuel line clip, Brennan said. It took 4 minutes. The attitude lasted longer, Kendra said. Rosalie grinned. It was the grin of a kid who has just correctly identified the family dynamic and found it satisfying. I like you guys, she said, to no one in particular. The walk to the car was 15 minutes because Rosalie's therapy instructions included daily distance in the chair, navigating her own path wherever possible. Brennan watched her handle the sidewalk transitions, the curb cuts, the slightly uneven section outside the coffee shop, and said nothing, unless she hit a spot that required a second attempt. And then he said one thing, quietly, without making a production of it. Rosalie accepted corrections the way good students accept them, quickly, without ego, and immediately trying again. By the time they reached the car, Kendra had told Rosalie about the Gerald Duck situation in complete detail, and Rosalie had produced the opinion that they should go back and implement a formal cracker distribution protocol. "You can't regulate ducks," Kendra said. "You can regulate the cracker supply," Rosalie said, which is the same thing functionally. Brennan listened to this conversation during the entire drive home and found he didn't want to turn on the radio. Adeline noticed changes in Rosalie that she couldn't entirely account for. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't 12 steps across a ballroom. It was smaller and in some ways harder to name. Rosalie started asking about things she'd previously avoided, about when she might be able to do the school's walking trail, about whether her wheelchair had a weight limit or whether she could put things in the back, about what muscles she should focus on in PT if she wanted to eventually manage stairs independently. She was making plans, small, practical, specific plans, the kind that required believing the future was worth planning for. Her therapist, Dr. Okafor, called Adeline on a Thursday in December, with a level of professional excitement that was barely contained under the clinical language. "I don't know what changed in the environmental dynamic, doctor," Okafor said, "and I know you've made no significant alterations to her treatment protocol, but Rosalie's engagement over the last 6 weeks has been categorically different. She's not just doing the work, she's tracking her own progress. She's asking me diagnostic questions about her own condition. She corrected my phrasing last Tuesday on something she'd looked up herself. She looked it up herself," Adeline repeated. "At length, apparently. She had a printed page with notes." Dr. Okafor paused. "She also told me, and I'm sharing this because it seems contextually relevant, that she wants to walk into her next school event without the chair. She set that as a personal goal, not something we discussed or suggested. She named it herself." Adeline sat with that for a moment after the call ended. She was at her office, the actual office, the one with the city view and the glass walls and the whiteboard full of quarterly projections, and the projection was still on the whiteboard, and she was looking at none of it. She was thinking about a park, a duck named Gerald, a man who talked to her daughter like she was a regular person and not a tragedy in need of managing. She picked up her phone and sent a text to Brennan that said, "Doctor." Okafor called. "Rosalie is setting her own goals now. I thought you should know." She hesitated, then added, "Thank you," and sent it before she could revise the 2 words into something more controlled. His reply came 40 minutes later. It said, "She's the one doing the work. But I'm glad to hear it." She read that 3 times. Then her assistant knocked, and she went back to the quarterly projections, but with slightly less weight in her chest than before. It was Kendra who accidentally broke the silence around Brennan's past. It happened on a Saturday in January. Both families had ended up at Brennan's rental, which was the first time Adeline had seen it small, clean, in the functional way of someone who maintains things out of discipline rather than aesthetic investment, with the kitchen table still showing the ghost marks of Kendra's various projects, and a cat that walked across Adeline's lap immediately upon her sitting down with the conviction of an animal operating on a prior arrangement. "He does that to everyone," Kendra said, not looking up from where she and Rosalie were working on something at the other end of the table. "Don't try to move him. He takes it personally." Adeline looked down at the cat. The cat looked back. She decided not to move him. They were deep in whatever project was happening at the other end. Rosalie was explaining something. Kendra was building something. Both of them operating in the self-sufficient way of kids who have established their collaborative roles and don't need input. And Adeline and Brennan were at the kitchen counter with coffee, talking about the kind of things 2 people talk about when they're getting comfortable: school schedules, vehicle maintenance, a neighborhood issue with the parking situation by the park. Then Kendra, without looking up, said, "Dad, Rosalie's asking about the deployment thing." The quality of silence that followed was specific. Brennan set down his coffee cup. "What deployment thing?" "The picture on my shelf." She asked what it was. Kendra still wasn't looking up. I said it was from when you were in the Navy. She wants to know why you don't talk about it. Rosalie had turned in her chair and was watching Brennan with that careful, direct gaze. You don't have to, she said. I was just curious. Brennan picked up his coffee cup again. He took a sip. He set it back down. What do you already know? He said. Rosalie thought about it seriously. You were in the Navy a long time. And you were in the part that does the hard stuff because there are pictures of you in the water with equipment. And then you stopped when Kendra's mom died. She paused. And you never really talk about it. That covers most of it, Brennan said. Why don't you talk about it? Kendra looked up now, waiting. Brennan looked at Rosalie for a moment. Then he looked at his daughter. Then he looked at the middle distance of the kitchen wall, and his expression was the kind that meant he was choosing something, not words, necessarily, but how honest to be, which was a different kind of choice. The things I was doing, he said, were things I was good at. Things that mattered in the sense that they were real and they had consequences. He paused. But the kind of good I was at that work, it required me to be a certain way. To have a certain relationship with things that would be hard on regular people. He paused again. When Kendra's mom died, I looked at my daughter, and I thought about the kind of person she needed me to be. And I realized I needed to choose. Between what? Rosalie said. Between what I was capable of, Brennan said, and what I wanted to be capable of. He looked at Rosalie evenly. That's not the same question for everybody, but it was the right question for me. The kitchen was very quiet. The cat shifted on Adeline's lap. Outside, a car passed. Kendra went back to her building project. Whatever she was building required significant structural attention. I think that's brave, Rosalie said. Brennan looked at her. Do you think choosing to stop something is brave? I think choosing what matters more is brave. Because you gave up one thing so she could have more of you. Rosalie shrugged in the small, slightly self-conscious way of a kid who has said something true and knows it, but isn't sure how to wear it yet. That seems hard. Adeline was looking at her coffee cup. Her face was very still. Brennan was quiet for a moment. Yeah, he said. It was. It was a Wednesday in late January when Adeline discovered what was being done to her company. The meeting had started as a routine financial review, one of the quarterly deep dives she ran with her chief financial officer and the senior audit team, the kind that lasted half a day and produced reports that lived in folders. Nobody opened unless something was wrong. Something was wrong. It declared itself in the numbers the way financial irregularities always did, not dramatically, but with the specific quiet consistency of water finding a crack. Numbers that should have added up a particular way and were adding up a different way, and had been for approximately 18 months. The CFO, Harrison Locke, was visibly uncomfortable, in the way of someone who has spotted the problem before the meeting and has spent the last 3 hours constructing careful language about it. Adeline let him get through the language and then said, "Where does it point?" It points toward a structured and deliberate siphoning of sensitive client data to a competing entity, Harrison said. The revenue damage is significant but recoverable. The breach itself, he paused. The breach requires someone with elevated internal access. Someone who has been inside the confidentiality protocols for long enough to understand how to move information without triggering the standard security flags. How long, Adeline said. 18 months is the conservative estimate. Possibly closer to 24. That's not external. No, Harrison said. It isn't. She spent the rest of that day building a list of people with the relevant access level. It was a short list, which made it worse. When a betrayal has to live inside a small circle, every person in that circle becomes a weight. Vaughn Mercer was on the list. Vaughn had been Adeline's security director for 6 years. He'd come with strong recommendations, a history of work in corporate intelligence, and the particular competence of someone who understood systems, because he'd spent years learning how to get around them. She had trusted him with the architecture of everything she needed to keep private access codes, event security protocols, the layered systems that kept Rosalie's schedule and location protected, the financial structures that supported the foundation. She had not wanted it to be Vaughn. But the data, when Marcus laid it out with the careful, methodical precision that had made him indispensable to her for 7 years, pointed with an efficiency that didn't leave room for alternative interpretation. 18 months, she said. She was in her home office now, late nearly 10 at night. He's been doing this for 18 months, and we didn't see it. The architecture of how he moved the information was sophisticated, Marcus said. He understood the detection systems because he helped design them, which means we can't assume the detection systems are reliable anymore. No. She thought about the event at the Hargrove Grand, the charity gala. Vaughn had been there, moving through the room with the quiet authority she'd always read as competence and was now reading as something else entirely. He'd been doing it that night too, 18 months of it. Standing next to her at functions, coordinating her security, knowing her building's layout, her schedule, her codes, all of it used as a tool she hadn't known, was in someone else's hand. I need to build the evidence package before I move on him, she said. If we go to him before we have everything locked, he destroys what we haven't found. Agreed. Marcus hesitated. Adeline. He still has access to the building systems. All of them. If he knows we're looking, then we work carefully and we work fast. She thought for a moment. And we work without telling anyone in the current security structure until we know exactly what we have. Marcus looked at her steadily. That's a smaller circle than you're used to operating in. I know, she paused. Get me what I need, all of it. Give me something solid enough that when I hand it to the investigators, there's nothing left for him to argue around. After Marcus left, she sat in the quiet of her office and thought about Vaughn, the handshakes, the briefings, the careful, steady presence she'd interpreted as loyalty. She thought about what it cost to maintain that face for 6 years. Whether a person knew, doing something like that they were making themselves into someone they couldn't come back from, or whether they told themselves a story that made it make sense. She wondered, briefly, if she'd missed something, if there had been a signal, a moment, a gap in the performance she could have caught. She decided that line of thinking wasn't useful and stopped pursuing it. Then she picked up her phone, not to call anyone, but because it was late and Rosalie was asleep down the hall and she needed something ordinary to hold on to, and she found herself looking at the text thread with Brennan, the sparse, practical, occasionally unexpectedly warm sequence of messages that had accumulated over the past 2 months like the record of something that had happened without being officially announced. She didn't send anything. There was nothing to send that wasn't a version of "I'm scared and I trust you," and she wasn't ready to say that directly even to herself. She put the phone down. She turned off the lamp. She sat in the dark for a little while and let herself feel the full weight of what she was carrying, because she'd learned that trying to outrun it only made it heavier. Then she got up and went to check on Rosalie. Her daughter was asleep with one leg outside the blanket, a habit she'd had since infancy, and her face was completely unguarded in the way faces get when some sleep removes all the work. The soft lamp from the hallway laid a stripe of light across the floor. Rosalie's breathing was even and slow. Adeline stood in the doorway and looked at her daughter for a long moment. Then she went to her own room and lay down with her clothes still on and stared at the ceiling and thought about evidence packages and security systems and a maintenance worker who had walked away from something. Extraordinary to be ordinary for the person who needed him. She thought about what it would cost her to be that kind of brave. She wasn't sure she was there yet, but she was starting to think about it. The evidence package took 9 days to build. In those 9 days, Adeline maintained her schedule with the precision of someone who cannot afford to signal that anything is wrong. She attended meetings. She answered emails. She spoke to Von Mercer twice, once in a corridor about the security rotation for an upcoming board event, once on the phone about an access system update she requested with no particular urgency. He sounded the same both times. Competent, calm. The particular performance of someone who has been performing for long enough that the performance has become its own kind of natural. It made something in her chest go cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. On the 8th day, Marcus delivered the final component, a financial record that created a direct, documentable chain between Vaughn's actions and the competing entity receiving the information. It was, Harrison confirmed, sufficient. The plan was simple: secure the evidence, forward it to the investigators, and begin the process of a controlled handover of Vaughn's access rights in a way that gave him no window to respond before the net closed. The company event at the Hargrove Grand, a quarterly board dinner, was scheduled for Friday. Adeline was considering moving it, but moving it would require explanation. An explanation required telling her board something she wasn't ready to tell them until the investigators had confirmed receipt. Friday it was. She arrived at the Hargrove Grand at 6 p.m. She didn't know yet that Vaughn had found out that morning. She didn't know that in the hours between her leaving her home and arriving at the hotel, he'd made the calculation that the only remaining option was the one she'd never expected, because she'd always underestimated the thing that drove him, not greed, not ideology, but the specific, unrelenting pride of a man who had spent 6 years being trusted and had decided that being trusted was worth less than whatever was being offered by the people on the other side of the transaction. She didn't know that he'd disabled 3 things in the building's security architecture at 5:47 p.m. She didn't know that Brennan was there. He wasn't scheduled. He'd come as a personal favor to the maintenance supervisor, covering a shift for a colleague who'd called in sick, because that's the kind of man he was, the kind who said yes to small inconvenient favors because someone needed it, and who showed up and did the work without making it a thing. He found out the shifts were wrong when the lights on the executive floor went out at 7:14 p.m. He was in the service corridor when it happened, and he stood very still in the sudden dark, and he listened to the building. And something that had been quiet for 4 years, something careful and specific and very well trained, came back online without a sound. The dark lasted 4 seconds before the emergency lighting kicked in. Not the full system, the backup strips along the base of the corridor walls, the kind designed to get people to exits and nothing more. They threw a low amber wash across the floor that made everything look like the inside of something that had already gone wrong. Brennan stood very still in it and listened. The building had a particular sound when it was operating normally. He'd spent 6 weeks learning that sound without meaning to the rhythm of HVAC cycles, the particular pitch of the elevator cables in the east shaft, the pattern of foot traffic that told him what time it was before he checked his watch. He knew this building the way he'd learned every environment he'd ever worked in, which was completely and without gaps, because gaps were where things went wrong. What he was hearing now was not normal. The building was too quiet on the upper floors. The ventilation cycle had stopped, which meant someone had cut power to specific systems rather than the whole grid. A whole grid failure sounded different and recovered differently. This was surgical. Someone had chosen what to turn off. He moved. Not fast drew attention, and attention right now was a variable he needed to control. He moved with the particular economy of someone who knows that speed is not the same as effective, and who has spent enough time in tight spaces to understand that measured and quiet covers ground faster than anything that announces itself. He hit the stairwell door at the east end of the corridor and took the stairs up. The executive floor was on 7. He knew that because the maintenance log had work orders for 7, the HVAC unit up there had been intermittent for 2 weeks, and he'd been on the rotation to check it twice. He knew the layout of 7, the way he knew the layout of every floor he'd worked, not from a blueprint, but from having walked every inch of it with a toolbox in his hand, from having noted where the structural columns were, where the emergency exits sat, which office doors had card readers, and which had standard locks. On the 4th floor landing, he ran into a knot of 5 hotel employees coming down, catering staff from the event, moving in the directed panic of people who know something is wrong but haven't been told what. "Keep going down," he said, all the way to the lobby. "Tell the front desk the executive floor needs emergency check." Use those words exactly. "What's happening?" One of them, a young woman with a catering lanyard, grabbed his arm. "Is it a fire?" "I don't know yet. Which is why you keep moving and let the people who are supposed to know figure it out." He looked at her directly. "You good?" She nodded. Go, they went. He kept climbing. On the 6th floor landing, his phone buzzed. He checked it without stopping. A text from Marcus, sent 90 seconds ago. "Where are you in the building?" Vaughn is not on the floor. Adeline is not responding. Brennan typed back one-handed while pushing through the door to the 6th floor corridor, 7th floor. "Stay in lobby. Call investigators now, don't wait for confirmation." Marcus's reply came in under 20 seconds, already called. ETA 12 minutes. 12 minutes. That was workable, depending on variables he didn't yet have. He moved through 6 toward the secondary stairwell at the far end, the one the catering staff used. Narrower, slower, but positioned at the opposite end from the main elevator bank, which meant if someone was watching the primary access points on 7, they wouldn't be watching this one. That was an assumption. He hated assumptions. He worked with them anyway because the alternative was standing still. The stairwell door to 7 was not locked. It should have been the executive floor used a card reader system on all access points. The fact that it was standing on its latch, held just barely open by the edge of the latch bolt, meant someone had either left quickly or had propped it and didn't care who came through. He came through carefully. The executive floor was different from the rest of the hotel, in the way that executive spaces always were quieter, wider corridors, the particular stillness of a space that cost a lot to inhabit and wanted you to feel it. The amber emergency lighting was the same down here, but the shadows were bigger. The corridor ran left toward the main boardroom and the suite of offices that the Prescott Company had block reserved for the event. To the right, a shorter corridor led to a service area and the freight elevator. He stood in the stairwell doorway and listened. There. A voice, male, coming from the direction of the boardroom. Low and controlled, with the particular cadence of someone who is used to controlling rooms and is working harder at it than usual. And under it, a second voice, female, quieter but not quiet in the way of someone frightened. Quiet in the way of someone buying time, Adeline. He moved left. Von Mercer had spent the better part of 6 years practicing patience, and it had served him well. You couldn't do what he'd been doing for 18 months without it. The careful timing, the precise windows, the patience to wait for the right gap in the audit cycle before moving information. He was good at patience, the way surgeons were good at stillness, because the alternative was catastrophic. But patience had a limit, and he'd hit his somewhere around 6 a.m. that morning when he'd found the first thread a discrepancy in the access logs that was too clean to be accidental, too targeted to be a routine scan. Someone had been looking specifically at his footprint. Someone who knew where to look. He'd spent the next 11 hours making decisions that couldn't be unmade. Disabling the executive floor systems had been practical, not theatrical. He needed time. He needed leverage. And Adeline Prescott, who was the only person in this building who could authorize an emergency override of the evidence lockdown before his extraction window closed, was attending a dinner 40 feet away. It had gone wrong almost immediately because she hadn't reacted the way he'd modeled. He'd expected control. He'd gotten it. But he'd also expected fear, and what he was getting instead was something adjacent to contempt, which he found significantly more irritating. She was sitting in the boardroom chair, at the head of the table. He hadn't told her to sit there. She'd simply chosen it, as if the situation had not altered the geometry of who was in charge, and she was looking at him with the particular steadiness of someone who has made a decision and is simply waiting for events to catch up to it. "The investigators already have the full package," she said. "Marcus sent it an hour ago." "That's not true," Vaughn said. "You can believe that if you want." She put both hands flat on the table, unhurried. "Or you can look at the metadata on the upload confirmation I have on my phone. 47 minutes ago. Before you killed the floor systems." She paused. "You moved too late, Vaughn." Something shifted behind his eyes. It wasn't rage. Vaughn didn't do rage. She'd always known that about him. It was recalculation. The same expression she'd seen in meetings when a deal structure fell apart, and he was already looking for the next configuration. "The data you submitted is partial," he said, "without the secondary files. The secondary files are in a cloud partition that was locked to your own access protocols 18 days ago," she said. "We've had a copy since day 15. You changed the access on day 17 and thought you'd close the window. You hadn't." She looked at him evenly. "Harrison is more thorough than you've been giving him credit for." Vaughn was quiet for a moment. "You could have come to me," he said. His voice had changed, slightly not softer, exactly, but the control of it was working harder. "Before any of this," and said what? Something. Anything. He moved to the side of the room, and it was the first time his movement had been not quite controlled. "I've been in this company for 6 years. I built half the systems you're using to prosecute me." He stopped. "You have what?" Adeline said. He didn't answer. "Say it," she said. "Say what you were going to say." "I have given this company everything," he said. The control had slipped another fraction. "And what I got for it wasn't enough," she said. "I know. I could see that, in retrospect. There was something in you that was always keeping score." She paused. "I missed it. I'm not going to pretend I didn't. But you could have talked to me." "You don't negotiate," he said. "You win, I try to," she said. "But I'm also a person, Vaughn. I make accommodations for people I trust." She let that land. "You could have tested that." Instead of this. The silence stretched. I need the override code, Vaughn said. His voice had come back to its controlled register, but it was thinner now, like a frequency being pushed past its comfortable range. Give me the code and I walk out of here, and what happens after that is on my terms, not yours. I'm not giving you the code.
Adeline.
There's no version of the next 10 minutes where I do that, she said. You know me well enough to know that. He did. That was the problem. He knew her well enough to know she wasn't bluffing, and that was a variable he hadn't been able to build around no matter how long he'd worked at it. He was still working through the implications of that when the door behind him opened. Brennan had heard enough through the door to know the shape of the situation before he came through it, which meant he didn't come through it fast or loud, or in a way that transformed the room into something Vaughn could react to. He came through it the way he'd come through 100 doors in a different life, measured, positioned with his weight already distributed for whatever came next. Vaughn turned. What he saw was a man in a maintenance worker's uniform, standing in the doorway with a toolbox in his hand and absolutely nothing on his face that communicated alarm. Building maintenance, Brennan said. Checking the emergency lighting systems on this floor. Vaughn looked at him for 2 seconds. Then get out. I've got a work order for this corridor. Brennan set the toolbox down against the doorframe with a sound that was ordinary and unhurried. Won't take long. I said get out. Vaughn's hand moved to the interior pocket of his jacket. Not all the way, just the preliminary movement of someone reminding themselves the option exists. Brennan looked at the pocket, looked back at Vaughn's face. You don't want to do that, he said. And why is that? Because the investigators are in the lobby, Brennan said. They were 12 minutes out when I was in the stairwell. That was 4 minutes ago. He paused. And because the move you're thinking about turns this into a different situation than the one you're already in. Right now you're looking at a hard landing. That other situation doesn't have a landing. Vaughn stared at him. You're maintenance, he said. But there was something uncertain in it. Now the particular uncertainty of someone who has looked at a face and found that the category they assigned it doesn't fit the data. Yeah, Brennan said. Who are you? I told you. Who are you actually? Brennan said nothing. He looked at Vaughn with the same flat, patient attention he'd been using since he came through the door, the attention of someone who is not performing calm because he is calm, which is a different thing entirely and significantly harder to discount. Vaughn looked at him for another long moment. Then he looked at Adeline, who was still sitting at the head of the table with her hands flat on the surface, watching. And something in Vaughn's architecture, the careful structure of a man who had spent years believing he was the most competent person in every room, cracked. Not dramatically, not with collapse, just a quiet internal settling, the way a wall sounds when the thing holding it up finally gives. He took his hand away from his jacket. The elevator access is down, Brennan said. Stairwell east is clear. If you go down now, you're in the lobby before they come up, which is better for everybody's paperwork. He paused. Your choice. Vaughn looked at him for one more beat. Then he walked to the door. He stopped when he reached Brennan, close enough that it was a choice, a last assertion of territory, maybe, or a test. Brennan didn't move. He stood with the same weight he'd been carrying since he came through the door, and let Vaughn make the calculation and come to the only conclusion available. Vaughn went through the door. Brennan listened to his footsteps move down the corridor, even and controlled to the last, because Vaughn Mercer was, to the end, a man who believed in the performance of composure. Then he heard the stairwell door. Then nothing. He turned. Adeline was looking at him from across the boardroom table. She hadn't moved, both hands still flat on the surface. But the stillness was different now, not the managed stillness of someone buying time. The other kind. The kind that happens when the thing you've been bracing against doesn't land. Are you hurt? He said. No. Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it that was not. You. No. She looked at him for a long moment. How long were you outside that door? Long enough. You heard what I said. Yeah. She looked at the table. She exhaled once, slowly through her nose. Then you let him walk. He was going to walk anyway, Brennan said. Down or up? Down's better. He moved to the side of the room and picked up the toolbox. He's got nowhere left to go that doesn't involve the people in the lobby. I just made the path obvious. You told him the investigators were already here. They are. You told him they were 12 minutes out. and that was 4 minutes ago. It was closer to 9 minutes out when I said it, Brennan said. I rounded. Something moved across Adeline's face. It wasn't quite a smile, the room wasn't built for that yet, but it was in the neighborhood. You lied to him, I simplified. Brennan. He needed one clear option, Brennan said. Arguing math wasn't going to help him see it. The door at the far end of the corridor opened multiple sets of footsteps. The particular cadence of official movement and voices began to fill the space beyond the boardroom. Adeline finally moved, standing from the chair and straightening in the way she had of assembling herself for whatever came next. How did you know to come up here? She said. I was in the stairwell. He paused. I heard it was wrong. That's not a specific answer. No, he agreed. She looked at him for a moment with those thorough eyes, and he could see the question forming the real one, the one she'd been accumulating pieces for since a service corridor on a Tuesday afternoon. He could see her decide this time to leave it where it was. Thank you, she said. I'm going to say it, she said. You can be uncomfortable about it, but I'm saying it. She held his gaze. Thank you. He was quiet for a beat. Then you bought yourself the time. I just closed the door. We can argue the credit allocation later. I won't argue it. You will, she said. You just don't know it yet. The investigators came through the door then, and the room filled with the practical business of what came after, and Brennan stepped back to the edge of it the way he always did present, available, unnecessary to the foreground. Von Mercer was arrested in the hotel lobby at 8:03 p.m. He went without incident, which Brennan thought said something, though he wouldn't have been able to say precisely what. The specific resignation of someone who has reached the place they were always going and has decided that the next performance is acceptance. Or maybe just exhaustion. He'd seen it before in other contexts, in other kinds of people, who had spent too long sustaining something that couldn't be sustained, and the end always looked roughly the same, regardless of the specifics. Brennan gave his statement to the investigators in the corridor outside the boardroom. He kept it accurate and minimal. When the lead investigator, a woman named Carver, with the methodical patience of someone who'd heard most stories and wasn't easily surprised, asked him to describe his role on the floor, he said he was maintenance staff covering a shift. And you went to the executive floor because power was out. It's my job to check the systems. You were aware of the situation with Mr. Mercer before you went up. I knew something was wrong with the building, Brennan said. The shutdown was deliberate. I could hear the pattern of it. You could hear the pattern of a deliberate power shutdown. Yes. Carver wrote something down. She looked up. Do you have a background in electrical systems? I have a background in noticing when things aren't right, Brennan said. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she wrote something else and said, We may follow up. Fine, he said. She moved on. He went back downstairs. The lobby was organized chaos. Hotel staff, board members who'd been evacuated from the dinner, 2 local news vehicles visible through the front doors that had appeared, with a speed suggesting someone had already put something on social media. Marcus was near the front desk with his phone and the expression of a man who had been putting out fires for 3 hours and had achieved a kind of transcendence. Adeline was with her board in a side room off the lobby. He could see her through the glass, standing, talking. The same bearing as always, but the overhead light in the room caught something in her face that was different. Not broken, just stripped of the particular gloss that money and control put on things. She looked real in a way she sometimes didn't. She saw him through the glass. She held his gaze for a moment, then she turned back to her board and kept talking. He sat in a lobby chair and waited, because he didn't have a clear exit, and the investigators had asked him to stay available, and because if he was being straightforward with himself in the way he usually tried to be, he was checking that everything was stable before he left. Habit. Old and very embedded. Kendra texted him at 8:47, You're late. Kat is being dramatic about dinner. Also, I looked online and there's something happening at that hotel. Are you there? He texted back at the hotel. Work thing. Be home by 10. Feed the cat. Kendra, the cat says you should have been home at 6. Brennan, tell the cat he doesn't pay rent. Kendra, he says he'll take that under consideration. He put the phone in his pocket. He leaned his head back against the lobby wall and closed his eyes for a moment, not sleeping, just resetting. Debriefing himself in the quiet internal way, the accounting of what had worked and what hadn't and what he'd do differently. The system still ran even when there was nothing operational requiring it. Some things became architecture and stayed that way. What hadn't worked, he'd assumed Vaughn was alone on the floor, which turned out to be true, but had been an assumption. He'd also assumed the secondary stairwell was clear, which it was, but that was luck more than certainty. He didn't love the luck component. In a different scenario, different variables, the luck doesn't hold. What had worked, Adeline Prescott had bought enough time. She'd kept the conversation running, kept Vaughn engaged in the negotiation he couldn't win, given him enough rope to talk himself into the corner that made the walkout the obvious choice. She'd done it with the instinct of someone who understood power and how to redirect it, which was not nothing. He thought about her hands flat on the table, the absolute refusal to perform fear for someone who wanted it. He was still thinking about it when her voice came from 3 feet away. "You should go home." He opened his eyes. She was standing in front of him in the lobby, jacket slightly wrong from where she'd had it pulled on in a hurry earlier. The board meeting had apparently concluded. "Investigators cleared me," he said. "I know. I'm not asking you to stay." She sat down in the chair beside him, which surprised him slightly. She looked at the lobby in front of them, the remaining activity, the 2 news cameras outside, the hotel staff finding their way back to ordinary function. "I'm saying you look like someone who wants to leave and is waiting to make sure things are settled first." He looked at her. "I know the type," she said, without looking at him. A moment passed. "Are things settled?" he said. "Enough for tonight." She paused. "Vaughn's in custody. The investigators have everything they need to build the case without any further company cooperation, which means I've got time to manage the board's response and the public communication before it's out of our hands." She exhaled. "It's bad, but it's a defined kind of bad that I can work with." "You did well in there," Brennan said. She looked at him. "Keeping him talking," Brennan said, not giving him the reaction he needed. "That was good work. I was terrified," she said. "I know." "You could tell?" "No," he said. "I just know you well enough now to know that you wouldn't not be." He paused. "The point is, it didn't change what you did." She was quiet for a moment. "I have to get on a call with my legal team in," she checked her phone, 8 minutes. "And then I have to figure out how to explain tonight to Rosalie without frightening her." She stood. "Will you?" She stopped. "Yeah," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "I haven't finished the question, I know. But yeah." Something moved across her face. The almost smile from the boardroom. "Closer this time." "Drive safe," she said. He picked up his toolbox and walked toward the service exit. The news story broke before he got home. Not the full story, the complete picture took another 48 hours to assemble, but enough. Corporate security director arrested in data breach conspiracy at Hargrove Grand. 2 of the outlets had grainy lobby footage. One of them had a brief clip that included, in the background, a man in a maintenance worker's uniform walking toward the service exit with a toolbox. Adeline's communications team put out a statement the following morning that was carefully constructed and accurate in every material sense, and that credited the company's internal audit team, the investigators, and the hotel staff for the swift resolution of the incident. It mentioned Von Mercer by name. It mentioned the investors, who had been receiving the stolen data by implication. It did not mention a maintenance contractor who had gone up a stairwell while other people went down. Brennan read the statement on his phone over coffee at the kitchen table while Kendra ate cereal across from him and watched him read. "There's a story about that hotel," Kendra said. "I know. Are you in it?" He set the phone down. He looked at his daughter. "No." She ate more cereal. She appeared to be thinking about something. "Did you want to be in it?" she said. He thought about Adeline's communications team. The careful statement, the specific deliberate absence. He thought about a phone call he'd received from Adeline at 7 a.m. before the statement went out that had lasted 90 seconds, in which she had said, "I'm not going to put you in this. I think you know why, and I think that's what you'd want. Tell me if I'm wrong." He'd said she wasn't wrong. She'd said, "Okay." And hung up. "No," he said to Kendra. "I didn't." She finished her cereal. She put the bowl in the sink without being asked, which was not her consistent habit, and therefore meaningful. "Dad," she said from the sink. Is she good?" Rosalie's mom. He looked at his coffee cup. He thought about hands flat on a table. The absence of performed fear. A 7-sentence letter on plain notepaper that had arrived between a water bill and a craft catalog, and that he had not thrown away. "Yeah," he said. "She's good." Kendra nodded once, the nod of a 9-year-old who has been gathering data for months and has now confirmed a conclusion she reached some time ago. "Okay," she said. She picked up her backpack and went to school. Brennan sat at the kitchen table with his coffee going cold and the morning light coming through the kitchen window at the particular angle it came through. In winter, low and slightly golden, and not quite warm enough to be warm. He sat there for a while. Then he picked up his phone, found a number he'd been looking at without dialing for 3 weeks, and dialed it. It rang twice. "Hello," Adeline said. "I've been thinking," Brennan said. A pause. About whether I'm interested in something other than maintenance work." He paused. "I know some things about building security systems. What they get right and what they miss. How people who know the inside of a system can use it against itself." He looked at the kitchen window. "I've been thinking it might be useful." The silence on the other end was the specific silence of someone not saying the first thing they thought of, which was a kind of discipline he recognized. "That would be useful," she said, "to a lot of people." "I'm not interested in a lot of people," he said. "I'm interested in starting one thing and doing it right." Another pause. "You'd need to build it yourself." "I know. I can't fund it. That changes the structure of it." "I know that too," but she said, "I can be your first client. On a contracted basis, full market rate." He thought about that. It was the right offer. The kind of offer that didn't compromise anything, not his independence, not her position, not the thing between them that neither of them had named yet, but that had been there long enough now to have taken root. "First client," he said. "First client," she confirmed. He could hear faintly, on her end, a small voice in the background asking something. Rosalie, probably. The sound of an ordinary morning in a house where things were getting better. "Okay," he said. He hung up, he finished his coffee. He got out a notebook from the kitchen drawer, the one Kendra used for school projects, mostly full, but with a few blank pages at the back, and he sat down at the kitchen table and started writing out, in the practical and thorough way of someone who has planned difficult things before, the shape of what he was going to build. The light through the window shifted as the morning moved. The cat climbed onto the table and was removed and climbed back. Somewhere outside, a neighbor's car started and drove away, and the street got quiet again. Brennan wrote, and for the first time in 4 years, he was not building towards something he was leaving behind. He was building towards something he was keeping. The consulting firm didn't have a name for the first 3 weeks. Brennan had the notebook. He had the framework, the thing he'd sketched at the kitchen table on the morning after the Hargrove Grand, in the back pages of Kendra's project notebook, between a diagram of the water cycle and a list of vocabulary words for a test she'd already taken. He had the specific and detailed knowledge of what building security systems got wrong, which was considerable, and he had the rarer knowledge of how people who understood those systems from the inside used that understanding as a weapon. He had, in other words, the most valuable thing any new business can have, a real problem he actually knew how to solve. What he didn't have was a name, because naming things required a kind of declaration he'd been working up to. Kendra named it, in the end. She came home from school on a Thursday in February, dropped her backpack on the kitchen floor with the particular impact of someone who has been carrying it too long, looked at the paper spread across the table and said, "Thorn Security Consulting." Obviously. Brennan looked at her. "It's your name," she said. "And it's what you do. Why would it be anything else?" He looked at the papers. He looked at his daughter. He thought about the particular kind of clarity that 9-year-olds had access to that adults spent enormous amounts of energy overcomplicating their way around. "Thorn Security Consulting," he said. "Obviously," Kendra said, and went to get a snack. He wrote it at the top of the first page of a fresh notebook that afternoon, and something about seeing it in his own handwriting made it real in a way the mental category of it hadn't quite managed. Not a big moment, just a small one that meant something. The first months were not easy, and he hadn't expected them to be. Adeline's contract gave him operating capital, not a gift, not charity, a genuine contracted engagement at genuine market rate for a genuine security audit of the Prescott Company's building systems across 3 facilities. The work was real, and he did it the way he did all work, completely, with attention to what was actually there, rather than what should theoretically be there. and with the specific interest of someone who finds the problem more compelling than the reputation of finding it. He submitted his first report in March. It was 47 pages and identified 11 significant vulnerabilities, 3 of which were critical, and the critical ones were not the ones anyone had flagged in the existing security reviews. Adeline read it over a weekend and called him on the Monday. "The third critical item," she said, "the access sequencing on the freight elevator bank. Yeah, our current security team marked that as low risk 18 months ago. Your current security team was looking at it as an isolated system. It's not isolated. It interfaces with the credential management for the service corridors in a way that creates a bypass window." He paused. Vaughn knew about it. He used it twice based on the access logs. A moment of silence. "How did you find that in the logs?" "I know what to look for." Another pause. The kind that meant she was writing something down. "Send me your recommended remediation for the freight system. And Brennan, the whole report is exceptional. I want you to know that." "The vulnerabilities were there," he said. "I just named them." "That's the entire job," she said, with a patience that wasn't quite exasperated. "That's what people pay for." He submitted the remediation plan. She implemented it within 6 weeks, which was faster than he'd anticipated, and told him something about how she operated when she trusted the information she was working with. Word moved the way it moves in professional circles, not fast, not loudly, but with the specific efficiency of people who have a problem and have found someone who can see it clearly. By April, he had a second client, a mid-sized property management company that had been dealing with internal theft they couldn't pin down, and whose existing security firm had been unable to locate the source. Brennan found it in 11 days. It was the building manager, and the method was elegant in the grim way of things that have worked for a long time. He'd exploited a gap in the camera coverage rotation that the security firm had flagged as acceptable because the risk assessment had been done by someone who'd never actually stood in the room. By May, he had a third client, and by June, he'd hired one person, a former military police investigator named Dara Osei, who had spent 8 years learning how systems failed and who had a nearly identical approach to Brennan's in terms of methodology and a completely different approach in terms of personality, which was to say she talked considerably more and found the talking useful where he found the quiet useful, and together they covered ground that either alone would have missed. Dara had one question when he interviewed her. At the end, after all the professional questions, "Why'd you leave the Navy?" He told her the short version. She nodded once, the nod of someone who understands the specific calculation without requiring it explained, and said, "All right, when do I start?" Kendra met Dara in June and decided within 15 minutes that she was excellent, on the grounds that Dara had strong opinions about breakfast food and was willing to defend them. Brennan observed this alliance with the mild alarm of someone who recognizes that the two most forthright people in his life have now located each other. Rosalie's goal had been to walk into her next school event without the chair. She'd set it herself in Dr. Okafor's office in December, and she'd been building toward it with the same patient, documented, self-tracked determination that she'd apparently applied to everything since the night in the ballroom. Her PT sessions had changed in character, not more frequent, but denser, more goal-directed, with Rosalie arriving with specific questions and specific progress reports that she kept in a notebook of her own. She fell 4 times in January during sessions. She documented each fall what had caused it, what she'd done wrong, what she'd do differently. Dr. Okafor showed Adeline the notebook during a February check-in, and Adeline had held it carefully, reading her daughter's handwriting, the matter-of-fact recording of failure and adjustment, and had felt something move through her chest that was too complex and too quiet to have a simple name. The school event was a spring performance in late April. Rosalie's class was presenting a project on ecosystems, the kind of slightly chaotic, endearingly imperfect elementary school production where the audio system works intermittently and at least one child forgets their line and is rescued by a classmate improvising loudly. Adeline arrived with Brennan and Kendra. This had become, without any particular announcement, the shape of how things worked. Not every event, not with any official designation, but consistently enough and naturally enough that the absence of it would have been the thing requiring explanation. They sat in the 3rd row. Brennan sat at the end of the row because he always sat at the end of rows, facing the exit, in the particular habit of someone whose body had learned to maintain that preference even in elementary school auditoriums. Adeline sat beside him. Kendra sat beside Adeline and had already identified 3 people she knew in the audience and waved at all of them. When Rosalie's class came out, she was at the back of the line. She was walking. Not fast, the particular careful walk of someone who has earned every step and knows exactly what it costs, and she had both arms slightly out from her sides in the balance compensation she'd been working on for months. And her jaw was set in the focused way that Adeline knew meant she was counting something internally, probably her breathing. But she was walking, down the side aisle to the front to her spot in the arrangement. 12 steps, 20, 26, Adeline counted without meaning to. She counted the way she'd heard Rosalie count in a ballroom 8 months ago, because when something matters that much, you pay attention to every unit of it. Brennan was very still beside her. When Rosalie reached her spot and turned to face the audience, she found her mother in the 3rd row immediately. She'd always been able to do that, even in crowded rooms, and she gave a small nod. Not a wave. A nod the kind that meant I did it, and also I knew I would, and also underneath both of those, watch this. Adeline pressed her lips together. Beside her, Brennan said nothing. But she felt, rather than saw, him exhale. After the performance, which was charming and imperfect and lasted 35 minutes, with the audio system cutting out twice and a child, named presumably Marcus, who improvised a full additional verse about coral reefs that was not in the original script and received a standing ovation from his own family. Rosalie found them in the lobby afterward, still walking, slightly slower now because the legs had been working for an hour and the fatigue was real, and she wasn't going to pretend it wasn't. She walked straight to Brennan. 29 steps down, she said. I counted. I know, he said. I counted too. She grinned, the wide, unguarded grin that her face made when it was done with performing and just being. Kendra said you'd be counting. Kendra exaggerates, Brennan said. Kendra's right, Adeline said from beside him. He looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them said anything else about it. The thing between them had been growing in the particular, unhurried way of things that neither person is pushing. It wasn't a story with clean chapters, no single night where everything changed, no declaration with proper staging. It was more like the way you notice, somewhere in March, that the light has shifted and things are growing that weren't growing in February, and you can't identify the exact day it started, but you know it's real because the evidence is everywhere. They talked more. Not about the practical things, the schedules, the clients, the children, though those conversations continued and were comfortable in a way early conversations rarely are, but about other things. About the decisions they'd each made that had shaped them into the particular version of themselves they were now. About what they'd gotten wrong and what they'd had to rebuild, and the difference between the two, which wasn't always obvious in the middle of it. Adeline told him about Rosalie's father one evening in May, sitting on the back porch of the rental while the girls were inside arguing about a board game, with the focused intensity of people who have discovered that they are perfectly matched as opponents. It wasn't a long story they hadn't been married. The relationship had been over before the accident, and the man in question had responded to Rosalie's injuries by becoming progressively less present until he was simply absent, which was a kind of cruelty that didn't announce itself as cruelty, but left the same damage. I told myself it was fine, Adeline said, that we didn't need the instability of someone like that in Rosalie's life. And that was true, but it was also partly easier to believe that than to let myself feel how much it cost to watch someone choose out. Brennan was quiet for a moment. Did Rosalie understand what happened? She understood that he stopped coming. She asked me once, when she was 6, whether she'd done something wrong. Adeline paused. That question. I've thought about it every week since she asked it. What did you tell her? I told her no. I told her that some adults don't know how to be what children need them to be, and that's always the adult's failure, not the child's. She looked at the yard. I don't know if that was the right answer. I don't know if there's a right answer. It was the honest one, Brennan said. Honest isn't always enough. No, but it's what you had. She looked at him. He was looking at the yard too, at the last of the evening light, and his profile in it was the face of someone who has said true things and knows their weight. You're good at that, she said. At what? At saying the true thing without making it a lesson. He looked at her. It's not a skill, he said. It's just I don't like wasting words. It's a skill, she said. You just don't want credit for it. He said nothing to that, which she had learned to interpret as a specific kind of concession. From inside the house, Kendra's voice rose with the precise outrage of someone who has been cheated at a board game by the most technically legal possible means. That is not how that rule works, Rosalie. Rosalie's voice entirely calm, it is exactly how that rule works. I read the whole booklet. You read the booklet before you suggested we play. I like to be prepared. Brennan and Adeline looked at each other. This time it was a real smile, both of them. At the same moment, the involuntary kind that happens when something is genuinely funny and there's no performance required. She read the booklet, Adeline said. I know, Brennan said. I taught her that. You taught your daughter to sandbag people at board games? I taught her to know the rules before she's in a situation that requires them. He paused. The application is hers. Adeline laughed. It was the kind of laugh she didn't do in boardrooms unguarded, a little too loud, the kind that she'd spent years editing out of professional contexts and had missed without knowing she was missing it. Brennan watched her laugh and thought, there it is. He'd been aware of the thing for a while. Not unaware of it, he wasn't built for that kind of willful blindness and wouldn't have respected it in himself if he'd tried. He'd been aware of it and honest with himself about it and had been waiting to understand it well enough to trust it, because he'd learned the hard way that the feeling of something and the readiness for something were not always the same timeline. He thought he was close to ready. He wasn't certain. But he'd made a career of making decisions under uncertainty, and he knew what certainty actually cost in time and missed opportunity. And he thought this was one of those cases where waiting for certainty was itself a kind of choice he didn't want to be making. He didn't say anything that night on the back porch. But he stopped talking himself out of the direction he was moving. It was Rosalie who set the timeline, though she didn't know that's what she was doing. She asked Adeline in September, almost exactly a year after the night in the ballroom, whether they could go back for the anniversary gala. The Prescott Foundation was holding the event again. The same hotel, the same charity, the same ballroom. Rosalie had heard about it from somewhere and had formed an opinion about attending. I want to go, she said at breakfast on a Saturday, with the directness she always had when she'd thought something through completely and was past the stage of asking. All of us. You and me and Brennan and Kendra. Adeline looked up from her coffee. Why? Because that's where it started. Rosalie was eating cereal and was very matter-of-fact about it. I want to go back when things are different. Things are different, Adeline said carefully. I know. That's why I want to go. Rosalie looked at her mother over the cereal bowl with those steady, unhurried eyes. And I want to walk across the ballroom. Adeline sets down her coffee. Rosalie, the whole thing. By myself. No chair in the room. She paused. I've been working on it. Dr. Okafor says I'm ready if I decide I'm ready. Another pause. I've decided. Adeline looked at her daughter for a long moment. The 8-year-old who had pushed herself out of a wheelchair toward a stranger in a crowded room because something in her had recognized something worth walking toward. The 9-year-old who kept a notebook of her own failures and used them as maps. The child who had survived more loss and fear and physical pain in her short life than most adults Adeline knew, and who had come through all of it, not without damage. The damage was real, and they didn't pretend otherwise, but without bitterness. Without the particular closing down that bitterness produces. Adeline thought about what that cost to maintain, what it required to be that open when life had given you adequate reasons to shut. Okay, she said. We'll go. Brennan heard about the plan from Kendra, who had heard about it from Rosalie, in the way that most information moved between the two families at this point through the girls, who operated on a need-to-know basis of their own design, and had apparently decided that both households needed to know everything simultaneously. Rosalie's planning something for the party at the hotel, Kendra told him, over dinner on a Wednesday. What kind of something? The walking kind. Kendra stabbed a piece of broccoli. She didn't tell me the details, but she got very specific about not telling me the details, which means she has details. Brennan thought about this. And you're okay with not knowing? Kendra looked at him with the expression of someone who has made peace with a thing that was not easy to make peace with. She said, I'll see it when it happens. She said it'll be worth it. A pause. She's usually right about what's worth it. He'd talked to Adeline the day before about something else, a new client referral she was passing to him. A conversation that had started professionally and run 20 minutes past any professional requirement, and he thought about calling her back about the Rosalie plan. He decided not to. Whatever Rosalie had arranged, she'd arranged it the way she arranged things, with intention and completeness, and putting it under a microscope wouldn't help it. He thought instead about what he wanted to say before that evening. He'd been carrying it for 3 weeks. Not because he didn't know what it was. He knew exactly what it was, but because he'd wanted to say it right, which was not a phrase he used often or lightly. He wasn't given to elaborate gestures. He didn't think the occasion required one. He just wanted to say it plainly, clearly, in a way that didn't dress up the truth in something it didn't need. He called Adeline that Thursday evening. She picked up on the second ring. Hey, he paused. I need to say something and I want to say it directly. A brief pause on her end. Okay, I'm not good at the performing of things. At the version where everything sounds arranged. He stopped. Started again. Over the past year, you've become one of the most important people in my life. I didn't plan that and I wasn't looking for it, and for a while I tried to be uncertain about it because it seems like the responsible approach. But I'm not actually uncertain about it, and I don't think pretending is doing either of us any good. The silence on the other end was the specific silence of someone who is very still. I know this is complicated, he said. I know you have things I don't, and I know what that imbalance looks like from the outside, and I know you're careful about it for Rosalie's sake, which is the right instinct. I'm not asking you to resolve all of that tonight. I'm just telling you where I am, Brennan, she said. Yeah, I have been waiting, she said, for approximately 6 months for you to say something in the exact general vicinity of what you just said. He was quiet for a moment. 6 months, give or take, a pause. I didn't push because it didn't feel like mine to push. But yes, 6 months. He processed that. I have a lot of patience, she said, but I want you to know it was not effortless. Something in him that had been held carefully for a long time released, not dramatically but completely, the way things release when they're ready and not before. I'm sorry it took that long, he said. You were sure when you were sure, she said. That's not something I'd change. They talked for another hour. Not about anything consequential, the kind of talking that happens when a door has opened and there's room to move through it without rushing. When they got off the phone, he sat at the kitchen table with the lights on and listened to Kendra moving around upstairs, particular rhythm of a 9-year-old getting ready for bed, and thought about the specific improbable chain of events that had led him from a service corridor with a toolbox to exactly here, and how none of it had been planned and all of it had been real. The night of the gala arrived in the particular way that significant nights often do, looking, on the surface, like an ordinary Friday. Brennan drove. Kendra sat in the back with Rosalie, who had been quiet in the car in the particular way of someone who is saving something. Adeline was in the front passenger seat, and in the 12 months since she'd stood at a mailbox, reading a 7-sentence letter, she had changed in ways that were visible if you'd been paying attention. The armor was still there, it was hers, and she'd built it for reasons that didn't disappear, but it sat differently. It had developed gaps in strategic places, and she knew where the gaps were, and she'd stopped trying to close all of them. The Hargrove Grand looked the same, the chandeliers, the marble, the specific architecture of money communicating its own importance to anyone who walked through the doors. What was different was that nobody looked at Brennan when he walked in. Not with assessment, not with dismissal, not with the social repositioning that a man in that building with that face and that bearing had previously prompted in crowds that had already made their judgment. He was with a woman most of them recognized, and a child who walked into the room the same way she'd apparently decided to approach everything, like she'd thought about it, and committed, and the context changed the reading. He was aware of it. He found it neither satisfying nor unsatisfying. It was information, the way everything was information, and he filed it without drama. The evening moved. Cocktails, the foundation's presentation, dinner. Kendra made a detailed study of the dessert table within the first 20 minutes and reported her findings to Rosalie, who had opinions about the distribution of the chocolate option. Brennan watched the room, not defensively but habitually, the positions, the exits, the patterns of movement. Old architecture. He'd probably always carry it. He'd made his peace with it as part of the structure of who he was, rather than a problem requiring removal. At some point during dinner, his hand found Adeline's under the table. Not a gesture, just a placement, natural and quiet. She turned her palm up. That was all. Rosalie saw it. Brennan noticed her notice it. She looked at her plate, and the corner of her mouth moved slightly upward in the expression of a child who has seen exactly what she expected to see and is being very dignified about having been right. After dinner, while the room was in the loose, conversational arrangement of the event's later hours, Rosalie excused herself to the restroom and came back without the chair. She had left it at the table. She had stood from it at some point in the restroom corridor and walked back on her own, through the edge of the ballroom, navigating the room the way she'd been navigating rooms for months, carefully, with attention, with the full knowledge of what her body could do right now and what it was still working toward. She stopped at the edge of the open space in the center of the room. Brennan saw her first, because he always saw the room, and he went very still. Then Adeline saw her, and her hand tightened slightly under the table. The room hadn't noticed yet. The room was doing what rooms do, talking, moving, the self-contained business of 100 people in the same space. Nobody had stopped. Nobody had turned. Rosalie looked across the open floor. She found Brennan's eyes, and then she began to walk. She walked across the ballroom. Not 12 steps this time. Not with trembling legs and the terrifying courage of a first attempt. She walked the way someone walks when they've earned it through 1,000 smaller moments that nobody saw: the falls, the notebooks, the counted steps, the sessions with Dr. Okafor, the mornings when it hurt and she did the work anyway, because she'd decided that the work was worth doing. She walked with the specific imperfection of a real body doing a hard thing, and the imperfection was not a flaw in the story. The imperfection was the story. People began to notice. The room changed the way it had changed a year ago, that particular shift in collective attention, the conversations dropping, the glasses being set down, the specific silence of a crowd that has stopped performing and started witnessing. Not a dramatic silence, just a real one. Rosalie walked the full width of the room. She stopped in front of Brennan. She was breathing harder than normal. Her legs were done. She'd be in the chair within the next 10 minutes, and she knew it and had planned for it. But right now she was standing, and she looked up at him with the same direct, unhurried gaze that had been looking at him since a ballroom floor 8 months ago when she'd waved at him through a therapy room window. "Everybody stayed away from you that day," she said. He crouched. Same as before, not all the way to the floor, just low enough. "You didn't," he said. She shook her head. "I knew you were good before everybody else did." She paused, and in the pause was the weight of everything that had happened in between: the park, the duck, the bus pickup, the kitchen table, the notebook, the 29 steps in a school auditorium, the man her mother looked at differently than she looked at anyone else. I just knew. Adeline had come to stand beside Brennan. She wasn't crying the way she'd cried a year ago, the shocked, overwhelmed tears of someone watching something impossible. She was crying the quieter way, the kind that happens when you've been hoping for something long enough to stop being surprised by it and start just being grateful. Kendra appeared on Rosalie's other side with the particular lack of fanfare of someone who had known this was coming and had positioned herself accordingly. "I told you she had details," she said to her father, not quietly. "You did," Brennan said. "You could have warned me," Rosalie said to Kendra. You said it would be worth it if I waited," Kendra said. "You were right. I'm acknowledging that." Rosalie looked at her. "Thank you." "Don't make it weird," Kendra said. Rosalie laughed, and Kendra laughed, and it was the laugh of two kids who have become the kind of friends that fill in the gaps that families leave. The kind that choose each other because they've looked at each other clearly and found something worth choosing. The room began to return to itself around them. People resumed conversations. A few people who'd been watching looked away with the slightly moved expressions of people who have seen something real and aren't quite sure what to do with it. Brennan stood. He looked at Adeline. She looked back at him with an expression that was not controlled and not performed, and not the face of a billionaire or a mother or any particular category of person, just the face of someone standing exactly where they are with nothing hidden. "Hi," she said. It was the smallest possible word. "Hi," he said. They were married the following spring. Not a large wedding. Neither of them wanted a large wedding, for different reasons that turned out to be the same reason. They'd both had enough of performing for rooms. 12 people in a garden. On a day that was supposed to be clear and produced 40 minutes of light rain mid-ceremony that nobody had planned for, and that Kendra described afterward as actually better, because the light after rain had a quality that warranted the opinion. Rosalie walked down the brief garden path as flower girl. She used no chair. She walked slowly and with attention, and she dropped approximately a third of the petals in the first 5 feet and distributed the rest with more intention. And it was imperfect in the specific way of real things done by real people, and it was the most beautiful thing in the garden. Kendra stood beside her father during the ceremony with her arms crossed and her chin slightly raised, the bearing of someone taking something seriously while also maintaining their composure, which was a combination she'd learned from watching him do it her whole life. Adeline had not written vows. Neither had Brennan. The decision had been mutual and arrived at separately, both of them, independently, telling the officiant that they'd say what they had to say when they were standing there, not before. The officiant, who had done enough weddings to know when to trust people, had agreed. What Adeline said was not long. She said that she had spent a very long time believing that being capable and being vulnerable were 2 separate modes, and that she had to choose between them. She said he had shown her, not by telling her, but by being the example of it, that the most capable thing she could do was to stop choosing. She said she loved him. She said she intended to tell him that regularly and directly, because she'd noticed he responded better to directness than to any other form of communication, and she intended to use that information. Brennan's was shorter. He said that the bravest person he'd ever known was 9 years old and had walked across a room when nobody believed she could, and that the second bravest person he'd ever known had been the one who'd learned to let her. He said he intended to spend the next portion of his life making sure that both of them always had someone in their corner who was paying attention. He paused and looked at Kendra. He said he was going to say the same thing to the other kid in his life, and Kendra looked at the garden very deliberately and said nothing, which meant she was moved and had decided that composure was the appropriate response. It rained again briefly after the ceremony. Nobody minded. The story people like to tell about Brennan Thorne, the version that circulated in the abbreviated way that stories do when they've been reduced to their outline, was the story of the maintenance man who turned out to be something more. The hidden past, the crisis at the hotel, the billionaire and the ordinary man and the little girl who couldn't walk. That story wasn't wrong. It just wasn't the thing that mattered most about it. What mattered most, the thing that got lost in the outline, was smaller and harder to summarize. It was a child deciding that a stranger was worth walking toward before she had any particular evidence for it. It was a man choosing every single day to be the version of himself that his daughter needed rather than the version the world found more legible. It was a woman learning, slowly and at real cost, that the thing she'd been protecting her daughter from was the same thing her daughter needed most, someone who wasn't afraid of the hard parts. People make the mistake of thinking courage is about doing the big thing in the critical moment. The kind of courage that actually changes a life is more expensive than that, because it doesn't happen once. It happens on the Tuesday when the work is harder than expected. It happens on the morning when you've fallen and the notebook is waiting and you write down what went wrong and get up again. It happens in the moment when you want to close the distance between yourself and someone worth reaching, and your history gives you 12 good reasons not to. The big moments, the ballroom, the boardroom, the walk across the garden in the rain, those are what's visible. What's real is everything underneath them. Rosalie still used her wheelchair some days. She would probably always use it on the hard days, and she'd decided, somewhere around the time she turned 10, that this was not a defeat. A wheelchair was a tool, and tools were for using, and she had never been interested in refusing help as a performance of strength. Strength was the notebook. Strength was getting up after the fall and writing down what happened. Strength was knowing the difference between what you needed and what you were ashamed to need, and refusing to let the shame make the decision. She told Kendra that once, on a bus home from school. Kendra had been quiet for a moment, and then said, "You should write that down." Rosalie had said, "I did," in the notebook. Kendra had said, "You're going to be really annoying when you're an adult." Rosalie had agreed that this was probably true. Brennan still sat at the end of rows. He still learned every room he entered. He still had, somewhere in himself, The architecture of someone trained to assess threats in the space of a second, the inventory of exits, the reading of posture, the quiet, constant awareness of what was happening at the edge of things. He'd stopped trying to dismantle it. It was part of how he'd been made, and the years since he'd left the Navy had not unmade it, and he thought now that they weren't supposed to. What changed was what he did with it. He'd used it once to navigate danger for other people. Now he used it to notice the small shifts in Kendra's face that meant she was struggling with something she hadn't found words for yet. The moment in a conversation when Adeline's shoulders dropped that fraction, that meant she'd stopped performing for the room and was just present. The first sign of fatigue in Rosalie's gait, that meant it was time to suggest the chair without making a thing of it. It turned out the skill was the same. The application was what had changed. Adeline still moved fast and thought faster, and had opinions about systems that she'd never entirely learned to keep to herself, which was fine because her opinions about systems were usually correct. She still pushed harder than she needed to sometimes, and overplanned, and struggled with the specific discomfort of not being able to control things she loved. She was still working on those parts of herself and expected to be working on them for a long time, because that was how it went with the things that were genuinely woven in. But she'd gotten better at naming them, and she'd gotten better at letting someone else hold the watch for a while. That was enough. You didn't need to be finished. You just needed to be moving in the right direction with people who were patient with the pace. The year after the wedding, Thorne Security Consulting took on its 13th client, which made it an actual company rather than a very organized collection of notebooks and good intentions. Dara ran the team meetings with the specific efficiency of someone who has decided that if they're going to do a thing, they're going to do it right, and produced documentation so thorough that Brennan sometimes read it and thought, I would have missed that. He told her so. She said, I know. That's why I'm here. He appreciated her more for the honesty. On a Tuesday evening in October, a year and a half after the garden wedding, Rosalie walked into the kitchen of their home, the new one, the one they'd chosen together, with the garden in the back that had been the site of both the wedding and an ongoing territorial dispute between the cat and a neighborhood bird that nobody was winning, and found Brennan at the table with the notebook, the new one that had replaced the one from Kendra's project section, working through something that looked like a client proposal. She pulled out a chair and sat down. He looked up. She put her notebook on the table, not his, hers, the one with the documented falls and the measured steps and the long, patient record of a person rebuilding something 1 inch at a time. I have 19 pages, she said. He looked at the notebook. What's on them? Everything. She put her hand flat on the cover. All the sessions, all the falls, what worked and what didn't and why. She looked at him steadily. Dr. Okafor said I should think about what to do with it. Because other kids are going through the same thing, and most of them don't have anyone who's been through it to talk to. Brennan was quiet for a moment. What do you want to do with it? He said. She thought about it the way she thought about things, seriously, without performing the thinking. I don't know yet, but I think it should exist in a form that someone else can use. She paused. I think the point of learning something hard is that it doesn't have to stop with you. He looked at his daughter, because that was what she was now, in the particular real and earned way of things that don't come from biology alone, and thought about a child in a ballroom who had walked toward a stranger because something in her had recognized something worth moving toward. She'd been right then. She was right now. Okay, he said. Then let's figure out what it looks like. She opened the notebook. He moved his chair over so they could both see the pages. Outside, Adeline's car pulled into the drive. Kendra's voice rose from the other room in the particular key of a preteen who has been wronged by a homework assignment and intends to be heard about it. The cat appeared on the table from nowhere with the conviction of an animal who considers all flat surfaces a personal resource. Brennan removed him. He came back. The house was loud and imperfect and entirely full, and the notebook sat open on the table, 19 pages of falls and adjustments and measured distances and the long, unheroic, necessary work of someone who had decided the floor was not the end of the story. It never is, for people who keep getting up. That's the whole thing, really. That's all of it. You fall, you write it down, you get up. And if you're paying attention, if you're actually paying attention, and not just surviving, you notice that the person who caught you the first time is still at the table. and you sit down beside them, and you open the book.